Section 13 of The Children of Odin. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Children of Odin. The Book of Northern Myths. By Padraic Colum. Part 2. Chapter 7. Aegir's Feast. How Thor Triumphed. The time between midday and evening wore on while the Aesir and the Vanir gathered for the feast in old Aegir's hall, listened to the stories that Loki told in mockery of Thor. The night came, but no banquet was made ready for the dwellers in Asgard. They called to Aegir's two underservants, Fimafengir and Elder, and they bade them bring them a supper. Slight was what they got, but they went to bed, saying, "Great must be the preparations that old Aegir is making to feast us tomorrow." The morrow came, and the midday of the morrow, and still the dwellers in Asgard saw no preparations being made for the banquet. Then Frey rose up and went to seek old Aegir, the giant king of the sea. He found him sitting with bowed head in his inner hall. "Ho, Aegir," he said, "what of the banquet that you have offered to the dwellers in Asgard?" Old Aegir mumbled and pulled at his beard. At last he looked his guest in the face and told why the banquet was not being made ready. The mead for the feast was not yet brewed, and there was little chance of being able to brew mead that would do for all, for Aegir's hall was lacking a mead kettle that would contain enough. When the Aesir and the Vanir heard this, they were sorely disappointed. Who now, outside of Asgard, would give them a feast? Aegir was the only one of the giants who was friendly to them, and Aegir could not give them full entertainment. Then a giant youth who was there spoke up and said, "My kinsman, the giant Hrymer, has a mead kettle that is a mile wide. If we could bring Hrymer's kettle here, what a feast we might have!" "One of us can go for that kettle," Frey said. "Ah, but Hrymer's dwelling is beyond the deepest forest and behind the highest mountain," the giant youth said, "and Hrymer himself is a rough and a churlish one to call on." "Still, one of us should go," Frey said. "I will go to Hrymer's dwelling," said Thor, standing up. "I will go to Hrymer's dwelling and get the mile-wide kettle from him by force or cunning." He had been sitting subdued under the mocking tales that Loki told of him, and he was pleased with this chance to make his prowess plain to the Aesir and the Vanir. He buckled on the belt that doubled his strength. He drew on the iron gloves that enabled him to grasp Mjolnir. He took his hammer in his hands, and he signed to the giant youth to come with him and be his guide. The Aesir and the Vanir applauded Thor as he stepped out of old Aegir's hall, but Loki, mischievous Loki, threw a gibe after him. "Do not let the hammer out of your hands this time, bride of Thrym," he shouted. Thor, with the giant youth to guide him, went through the deepest forest and over the highest mountain. He came at last to the giant's dwelling. On a hillock before Hrymer's house was a dreadful warden. A giant crone she was, with heads a-many growing out of her shoulders. She was squatting down on her ankles, and her heads, growing in bunches, were looking in different directions. As Thor and the giant youth came near, screams and yelps came from all her heads. Thor grasped his hammer and would have flung it at her if a giant woman, making a sign of peace, had not come to the door of the dwelling. The youthful giant who was with Thor greeted her as his mother. "Son, come within," said she, "and you may bring your fellow-farer with you." The giant crone, she was Hrymer's grandmother, kept up her screaming and yelping, but Thor went past her and into the giant's dwelling. When she saw that it was one of the dwellers in Asgard who had come with her son, the giant woman grew fearful for them both. "Hrymer," she said, "will be in a rage to find one of the Aesir under his roof. He will strive to slay you." "It is not likely he will succeed," Thor said, grasping Mjolnir, the hammer that all the giant race knew of and dreaded. "Hide from him," said the giant woman. "He may injure my son in his rage to find you here." "I am not wont to hide from the giants," Thor said. "Hide only for a little while. Hide until Hrymer has eaten," the giant woman pleaded. "He comes back from the chase in a stormy temper. After he has eaten, he is easier to deal with. Hide until he has finished supper." Thor at last agreed to do this. He and the giant youth hid behind a pillar in the hall. They were barely hidden when they heard the clatter of the giant's step as he came through the courtyard. He came to the door. His beard was like a frozen forest around his mouth, and he dragged along with him a wild bull that he had captured in the chase. So proud was he of his capture that he dragged it into the hall. "I have taken alive," he shouted, "the bull with the mightiest head and horns. Heaven-breaking this bull is called. No giant but me could capture it." He tied the bull to the post of the door, and then his eyes went toward the pillar behind which Thor and the giant youth were hiding. The pillar split up its whole length at that look from Hrymer's eyes. He came nearer. The pillar of stone broke across. It fell with the cross-beam it supported, and all the kettles and cauldrons that were hanging on the beam came down with a terrible rattle. Then Thor stepped out and faced the wrathful giant. "It is I who am here, friend Hrymer," he said, his hands resting on his hammer. Then Hrymer, who knew Thor and knew the force of Thor's hammer, drew back. "Now that you are in my house, Asa Thor," he said, "I will not quarrel with you. Make supper ready for Asa Thor and your son and myself," said he to the giant woman. A plentiful supper was spread, and Hrymer and Thor and the giant youth sat down to 3 whole roast oxen. Thor ate the whole of 1 ox. Hrymer, who had eaten nearly 2 himself, leaving only small cuts for his wife and his youthful kinsman, grumbled at Thor's appetite. "You'll clear my fields, Asa Thor," he said, "if you stay long with me." "Do not grumble, Hrymer," Thor said. "Tomorrow I'll go fishing, and I'll bring you back the weight of what I ate." "Then instead of hunting, I'll go fishing with you tomorrow, Asa Thor," said Hrymer, "and don't be frightened if I take you out on a rough sea." Hrymer was first out of bed the next morning. He came with the pole and the ropes in his hand to where Thor was sleeping. "Time to start earning your meal, Asa Thor," said he. Thor got out of bed, and when they were both in the courtyard, the giant said, "You'll have to provide a bait for yourself. Mind that you take a bait large enough. It is not where the little fishes are, the place where I'm going to take you. If you never saw monsters before, you'll see them now. I'm glad, Asa Thor, that you spoke of going fishing." "Will this bait be big enough?" said Thor, laying his hands on the horns of the bull that Hrymer had captured and brought home, the bull with the mighty head of horns that was called Heaven-breaking. "Will this bait be big enough, do you think?" "Yes, if you're big enough to handle it," said the giant. Thor said nothing, but he struck the bull full in the middle of the forehead with his fist. The great creature fell down dead. Thor then twisted the bull's head off. "I have my bait, and I'm ready to go with you, Hrymer," he said. Hrymer had turned away to hide the rage he was in at seeing Thor do such a feat. He walked down to the boat without speaking. "You may row for the first few strokes," said Hrymer when they were in the boat, "but when we come to where the ocean is rough, why, I'll take the oars from you." Without saying a word, Thor made a few strokes that took the boat out into the middle of the ocean. Hrymer was in a rage to think that he could not show himself greater than Thor. He let out his line and began to fish. Soon he felt something huge on his hook. The boat rocked and rocked till Thor steadied it. Then Hrymer drew into the boat the largest whale that was in these seas. "Good fishing," said Thor, as he put his own bait on the line. "It's something for you to tell the Aesir," said Hrymer. "I thought as you were here I'd show you something bigger than salmon fishing." "I'll try my luck now," said Thor. He threw out a line that had at the end of it the mighty horned head of the great bull. Down, down the head went. It passed where the whales swim, and the whales were afraid to gulp at the mighty horns. Down, down it went, till it came near where the monster serpent that coils itself round the world abides. It reared its head up from its serpent coils as Thor's bait came down through the depths of the ocean. It gulped at the head and drew it into its gullet. There the great hook stuck. Terribly surprised was the serpent monster. It lashed the ocean into a fury. But still the hook stayed. Then it strove to draw down to the depths of the ocean the boat of those who had hooked it. Thor put his legs across the boat and stretched them till they touched the bottom bed of the ocean. On the bottom bed of the ocean Thor stood and he pulled on his line. The serpent monster lashed the ocean into fiercer and fiercer storms, and all the world's ships were hurled against each other and wrecked and tossed. But it had to loosen coil after coil of the coils it makes around the world. Thor pulled and pulled. Then the terrible head of the serpent monster appeared above the waters. It reared over the boat that Hrymr sat in and that Thor straddled across. Thor dropped the line and took up Mjolnir, his mighty hammer. He raised it to strike the head of the serpent monster, whose coils go round the world. But Hrymr would not have that happen. Rather than have Thor pass him by such a feat, he cut the line, and the head of the serpent monster sank back into the sea. Thor's hammer was raised. He hurled that hammer that always came back to his hand. It followed the sinking head through fathom after fathom of the ocean deep. It struck the serpent monster a blow, but not such a deadly blow as would have been struck if the water had not come between. A bellow of pain came up from the depths of the ocean, such a bellow of pain that all in Jotunheim were affrighted. "This surely is something to tell the Aesir of," said Thor. "Something to make them forget Loki's mockeries." Without speaking, Hrymr turned the boat and rowed toward the shore, dragging the whale in the wake. He was in such a rage to think that one of the Aesir had done a feat surpassing his that he would not speak. At supper, too, he remained silent, but Thor talked for two, boasting loudly of his triumph over the monster serpent. "No doubt you think yourself very powerful, Asa Thor," Hrymr said at last. "Well, do you think you are powerful enough to break the cup that is before you?" Thor took up the cup, and with a laugh he hurled it against the stone pillar of the house. The cup fell down on the floor without a crack or a dint in it, but the pillar was shattered with the blow. The giant laughed. "So feeble are the folk of Asgard," he said. Thor took up the cup again and flung it with greater force against the stone pillar, and again the cup fell to the ground without a crack or a dint. Then he heard the woman who was the mother of the giant youth sing softly as she plied her wheel behind him. "Not at the pillar of the stead, but at Hrymr's massy head, when you next the goblet throw, let his head receive the blow." Thor took up the cup again. He flung it not at the pillar this time, but at Hrymr's head. It struck the giant full on the forehead and fell down on the floor in pieces, and Hrymr's head was left without a dint or a crack. "Ha! So you can break a cup, but can you lift up my mile-wide kettle?" cried the giant. "Show me where your mile-wide kettle is, and I shall try to lift it," cried Thor. The giant took up the flooring and showed him the mile-wide kettle down in the cellar. Thor stooped up and took the kettle by the brim. He lifted it slowly, as if with a mighty effort. "You can lift, but can you carry it?" said the giant. "I will try to do that," said Thor. He lifted the kettle up and placed it on his head. He strode to the door and out of the house before the giant could lay hands on him. Then, when he was outside, he started to run. He was across the mountain before he looked behind him. He heard a yelping and a screaming, and he saw the giant crone with the bunch of heads running after him. Up hill and down dale Thor raced, the mile-wide kettle on his head, and the giant crone in chase of him. Through the deep forest he ran, and over the high mountain, but still Bunch of Heads kept him in chase. But at last, jumping over a lake, she fell in, and Thor was free of his pursuer. And so back to the Aesir and the Vanir Thor came in triumph, carrying on his head the mile-wide kettle. And those of the Aesir and the Vanir who had laughed most at Loki's mockeries rose up and cheered for him as he came in. The mead was brewed, the feast was spread, and the greatest banquet that ever the kings of the giants gave to the dwellers in Asgard was eaten in gladness. A strange and silent figure sat at the banquet. It was the figure of a giant, and no one knew who he was, nor where he had come from. But when the banquet was ended, Odin, the eldest of the gods, turned toward this figure and said, "O Skirmir, giant king of Utgard, rise up now and tell Thor of all you practiced upon him when he and Loki came to your city." Then the stranger at the banquet stood up, and Thor and Loki saw he was the giant king in whose halls they had had the contests. Skirmir turned toward them and said, "O Thor, and O Loki, I will reveal to you now the deceits I practiced on you both. It was I whom ye met on the moorland on the day before ye came into Utgard. I gave you my name as Skirmir, and I did all I might do to prevent your entering our city, for the giants dreaded a contest of strength with Asa Thor. Now hear me, O Thor. The wallet I gave for you to take provisions out of was tied with magic knots. No one could undo them by strength or cleverness, and while you were striving to undo them, I placed a mountain of rock between myself and you. The hammer blows, which as you thought struck me, struck the mountain and made great clefts and gaps in it. When I knew the strength of your tremendous blows, I was more and more in dread of your coming into our city. I saw you would have to be deceived by magic. Your lad Thjalfi was the one whom I first deceived, for it was not a giant youth who raced against him, but thought itself. And even you, O Loki, I deceived, for when you tried to make yourself out the greatest of eaters, I pitted against you, not a giant, but fire that devours everything. You, Thor, were deceived in all the contests. After you had taken the drinking horn in your hands, we were all affrighted to see how much you were able to gulp down, for the end of that horn was in the sea, and Aegir, who is here, can tell you that after you had drunk from it, the level of the sea went down. The cat whom you strove to lift was Nidhogg, the dragon that gnaws at the roots of Yggdrasil, the tree of trees. Truly we were terrified when we saw that you made Nidhogg budge. When you made the back of the cat reach the roof of our palace, we said to ourselves, Thor is the mightiest of all the beings we have known. Lastly, you strove with the hag Ellie. Her strength seemed marvelous to you, and you thought yourself disgraced because you could not throw her. But know, Thor, that Ellie whom you wrestled with was old age herself. We were terrified again to see that she who can overthrow all was not able to force you prone upon the ground. So Skimir spoke, and then left the hall. And once more the Aesir and the Vanir stood up and cheered for Thor, the strongest of all who guarded Asgard. End of section 13.